how would we overcome the political and psychological component of deflation versus inflation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think it's the opposite of what's happening right now. Because
Yeah.
right now we're in an inflationary recession and the numbers are still going up. So you feel richer, but where do you pay for it? You pay for it in your quality of life and your standard of living. So the numbers going up on my screen, but my quality of life and standard of living are going down.
Yes.
Now, if the number is going down on my screen, but my quality of life and standard of living are going up, then that's what kind of offsets that. But of course, in theory, it's hard to say, well, my life's going to be better. You actually have to go through it and experience it. You have to go through it and experience it to understand that even though number go up, the quality of life and standard of living is going down. And that's exactly what this inflationary recession that we're in right now is happening. The misinterpretation of inflation, which this comes back to education as well, Adam. I love, I mean, we vibe on so many levels, but it's so true that people just don't understand the basics. And for all your listeners out there, I hope you're all using the real rate of return when you're managing your money, because you have the nominal rate of return on a US Treasury bill at 5%. Then you have the government. You know what, Adam, can you pull up for me? Just go to govflation.com, govflation.com. And what you're going to see here is what the government says versus what the reality says. Now, let me define the reality real quick, because what we did here was we went back to post 70s inflation. So we're talking early 80s. And we went back to the CPI equation that the government created and financed after the inflation crisis. So this CPI is actually pretty darn good. It's pretty accurate. And it's without all the hedonics. It's without all the adjustments that they've made over time. So you can see the government today is saying that CPI is 3.1%. And they're saying that the real return is 2.4%, because if you take the 5.5, the high end of the federal funds effective rate, and you subtract government CPI, you get a real rate of return of plus 2.4%. Well, you don't have to be a genius to figure out that if you've owned treasury bonds for the last year, you're not buying 2.4% more stuff this year, right? Because of the prices are far outpacing the government's inflation rate. So what we did, we said, well, look, we can't do what Truflation did and come up with a proprietary equation. Let's go back to the original government equation that they financed, that they created before they started doing all the substitution, before they started doing all the manipulations and hedonics. And if you do that, the rate of inflation today is 10.9%. 10.9%. Now, if you subtract 5.5 from 10.9, your real rate of return is negative. It's negative 5.4%. So even though you're in cash and you're earning yield, next year you're going to be able to buy 5.4% less of a groceries, smaller of everything. And it's important for people to be educated and understand the difference between the nominal rate and the real rate. Now, here's one of the most important things I will say all night. This is, in my opinion, this is the most important piece of macro finance that is just being ignored by the mainstream. The number one reason they're ignoring it is because they believe the government CPI. But here's my statement. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury have lost the ability to raise real interest rates. The Federal Reserve and the U.S. Treasury have lost the ability to raise real interest rates. What do you mean, CJ? Well, when they raise the interest rate, something happens. The interest expense increases. And when the interest expense increases, it requires more inflation. In other words, in order to print $34 trillion and to actively roll over that $34 trillion of debt, I think $10 trillion matures in the next couple of years. But to pay for this $34 trillion in debt, as well as the $211 trillion of unfunded liabilities, we have to finance that into the future. Just ask yourself a question. Does it take less inflation to roll over $34 trillion at 0.25% or at 5%? Right? It's common sense. Obviously, it costs more. It requires more printing to borrow at 5% than it does to borrow at 0.25%. So higher interest rates actually increase the rate of inflation. That, a lot of people kind of get triggered by that, but it's true. That's the math. Because of $34 trillion of debt and because of $211 trillion of unfunded liabilities, higher interest rates require additional printing, which makes inflation go higher. Well, here's why that's important. Because you have to subtract the real inflation rate from the rate of return to get your real rate. So right now, you have to subtract the real rate of inflation, 10.9%, from the 5.5% maximum you can get from the Treasury bill to get your real return. Well, if they raise interest rates, let's say they raise interest rates to 6%. Well, if inflation goes from, and let's just use the government's official numbers right here. If the inflation goes from 3% up to 6%, well, 6% minus 6% is 0. So they raised interest rates. That is supposed to increase the real rate of return. But because of the underlying dynamics, because of what's really happening here with the amount of inflation that's required to finance the debt, the real rate of return goes more negative. So the interest rate goes up. People are supposed to be incentivized to buy more of the debt. But in reality, the smart money is backing away further because the real rate is going more negative. The government and the Treasury should be able to raise interest rates to incentivize you to lend them money. But that's because when they raised interest rates and the debt burden wasn't there, the real rate of return would go up, and that would incentivize you to lend them money. But now that they're raising interest rates and these huge burden of debt is there, creating massive interest payments in the United States, the interest expenditure is now one of the top line items in our budget. And it won't be long before it becomes the number one line item in our budget. So that additional expense that gets paid into the economy, and spent into the economy, that's inflationary. And what that does is it increases the inflation rate. Well, when the inflation rate increases, you have to subtract a bigger number from that nominal yield in order to get your real rate. So as they raise interest rates, inflation goes up and real rates go more negative. This is the biggest piece of news. To me, this is the final alarm and warning bell going off that signals to me that they have lost control of the yield curve. They cannot do what they should be able to do to incentivize people to lend to them, which is to raise interest rates. Because when they raise those rates, it causes inflation to go up, which causes real rates to go more negative. This, I can't say it any other way, but this is really important for people to understand. They have lost control of the yield curve.
How do they get the control back?
They can try yield curve control, but look no further than Japan to understand how much inflation that's going to require. And then if they have to use inflation to control the curve, that makes the problem even worse because now inflation goes up and real rates go even more negative. The only thing they can do is create inflation. And the only thing that creating inflation does is make real rates more negative. There's literally nothing they can do. This is a ticking time bomb. We're looking at the death spiral right in the face.
Where does it end? How does it end?
It ends with a loss of trust. This will go on perpetually until finally the quality of life and the standard of living are so low that people lose trust. And I think Snowden just sent out a tweet the other day that was very interesting. He said he predicts that governments are going to come out this year and announce that they're stacking Bitcoin. So when we get to the point where governments can do what Michael Saylor does, right? Michael Saylor issues debt and then buys Bitcoin with the debt. And then over time, the equity value of its balance sheet goes up and he can issue more debt and buy more Bitcoin. Well, governments are not going to be constrained by the equity value growing on their balance sheet. They're just going to print to infinity and buy Bitcoin. And when governments come out and say, we're printing to infinity to buy Bitcoin for your own good, to protect you, then people are going to lose trust. Now that there could be other elements. You and I know, hey, the politicians are doing a great job to earn our trust, aren't they? Don't you trust your kid with the politicians? Look, trust is breaking down. And the only difference between inflation and hyperinflation is trust. There's not mathematically, the textbooks will try to tell you 50% month over month is hyperinflation. I'm trying to tell you, in my studies of all the fiat currencies that have failed, none of them have succeeded. And through all of those failures, the hyperinflationary portion starts when the people finally lost trust. There was no mathematical point that it began. It was all based on the sociological trust of the people. And governments are abusing that trust through not even following the laws that we have written for border control, by printing money and giving it back to themselves, by diluting their own people. So we're seeing an abuse of trust start to pick up at the same time as these helicopter money. Remember, they have already printed money and sent it to us like we're some banana republic. We are already in the final stages of this currency's life cycle. We are past the helicopter money stage, and we are now at the point where they've lost control of the yield curve. There is no way for them to raise real interest rates. This is coming to an end, and it ends with a loss of trust.
How much time?
Nobody knows. Nobody knows.
What you said to me, which is both petrifying and exciting as a Bitcoin holder, when you said when governments start printing their money to buy Bitcoin, that is actually where you see the price of Bitcoin is realistically infinity. And if I run that thought experiment out very quickly, just in my mind, you have all of these nations very quickly competing with themselves to buy up the Bitcoin. All of these nations very quickly hyperinflate their own currency, collapse their own currency as they scramble to the lifeboat of Bitcoin. But those who are on there first, like El Salvador as an example, they front run the market. And then, of course, you've got all the Michael Saylors and even the BlackRocks. And even, the early Bitcoin adopters, in theory, they could have more Bitcoin than governments themselves.
Yeah, that's my personal goal.
So is El Salvador, did they do the right thing?
Oh, absolutely. Look, we all had a chance to front run the institutions. And if you didn't listen to people like Adam and myself, who have been basically begging you to do this, well, you haven't missed out on the final opportunity, because you can join the institutions in front running the governments, because that's the stage at what we're at right now. The institutions are now front running the governments. The governments are going to be last. And El Salvador front running them just shows the level of understanding from their president. And it's amazing what's going on over there. They're going to be successful because they have an equity-based layer that they're building their economy on. Now, it's going to take time. It's not going to happen overnight, but they're putting themselves into a position to be a global leader when this transfer of wealth happens, because it will happen. So join the institutions now to front run the governments, because by the time the governments figure this out, we are at the point where we're going to move up the S-curve of adoption. And what's interesting is, if you look at like a horse and carriage and a car, at first, like the horse and carriage people were like, the car is a scam, the car is dangerous, they saying all these things. And what's interesting is that on the S-curve of adoption, as the car went up the S-curve of adoption, the horse and carriage went down the S-curve of adoption. There's this famous picture in Chicago where there's one car on the road surrounded by a whole bunch of horse and buggies. And 1 year later, there was all cars on the road with just one horse and buggy. So when Bitcoin begins its process up the S-curve of adoption, that's going to be the same time that these fiats begin the downward move from their S-curve adoption. It's going to be an S-curve of letting it go, the reverse adoption. So as Bitcoin goes up to the top of its S-curve, the dollar will go down to the bottom of its S-curve. Just like when cars went up its S-curve, horse and carriage went down its S-curve. And the catalyst for that is trust.